Hi, today we're going to be talking about a specific issue in democracy for our final project. My name is Daisy Elliott.
And I'm Danya Mishkin.
Talking about is low youth voter turnout in the US. Compared to other comparable democracies, which we'll get into later, the US consistently votes among some of the lowest in youth voter turnout. Now let's look at some statistics.
So looking at our first graph, we first decided to choose a graph of citizen voting age population turnout by age, just so we could kind of set the stage and give some context to the situation. So we can see the legend on the bottom and the blue line. We can see that ages 18 to 29 has the lowest voter turnout, whereas ages 60 plus has the highest voter turnout.
Similarly, you can now we'll look at how the US compares to other countries in percentage in comparison to other comparable democracies. You can see that the United States is right here, meaning that fewer than half of Americans 18 to 29 voted in the 2016 election. And this is more of a gap of more than 15 points in comparison to overall turnout of other ages. You can see here that democracies that we are often compared to, such as Sweden, Denmark, are voting at much, much higher rates.
So next we wanted to talk about how the US is on the low end of youth turnout. We wanted to put kind of a bar graph showing different countries just so we could give more context to the situation. And we can see in the rank of the US that the US ranks pretty low. It's fifth down, whereas Sweden is the highest with the highest youth voter turnout. So through this project, we were trying to come up with a solution to increase youth voter turnout.
So this is a graph that shows young adults ages 18 to 24 who voted in 2018 midterm elections. And as you can see, youth voter turnout was significantly up from 2014 to 2018. So this is good news that there is an increase, but as you saw in the last slide, we are still way behind other peer democracies. And we'll talk about what these increases may be attributed to later on.
So next, we wanted to talk about youth voter turnout in presidential elections, just on a much bigger scale from 1972 to 2020. And looking at the graph starting at 1972, you can notice a lot of dips and peaks. And you can see around 1992, there was a pretty big increase with 52% voter turnout. But then as we pass on to 2020, like Daisy was saying, there was a higher voter turnout of 55% of youth voters.
So now we're going to go into what made this low turnout be attributed to. So a lot of scholars have looked at this and looked at data, and it's due to a variety of factors. So one of these factors is habit formation. So habit formation basically means that voting is a habit formed over time. So because young people are younger and have been here on voting for less of a long time, they thus vote less frequently because they've had fewer opportunities to form and reinforce this habit of voting. And then with time, people slowly turn from habitual non-voters to habitual voters, which may help to explain why older groups tend to vote at higher rates.
So next we wanted to look at the opportunity cost, and there's a direct opportunity cost for young adults who may have less flexible employment schedules or less financial cushion to take time off from their work to vote, or who may be in temporary housing situations where they lack deep community ties. They may not know where their polling places are. They may not know enough about the candidates. We also wanted to talk about how there's an indirect opportunity cost to learning the process of voting. Like I mentioned, finding a polling place and learning about the candidates.
So there's another factor that's called alternative participation. And this kind of gets at the fact that perhaps lower election turnout in general over time has been also accompanied by a rise in other forms of citizen Citizen activism, such as mass protests, Occupy movements, increased use of social media as a new platform of political engagement. And that may help to describe that fluctuation between 1972 and 2020 we saw, that it kept dipping, and perhaps that was due to alternative participation in democracy.
So next, we wanted to take a look at Albert and Kohler's argument from class. So just to kind of sum it up, well, when citizens feel that their governments care about them, this is known as high state inclusiveness, and high state inclusiveness leads to a higher voter turnout because the citizens within their society feel that they have a voice and a say within their government. This then leads to citizens feeling that their government does care about them, that they do have a voice. And then conversely, when citizens feel that their government does not care about them, there's a lower voter turnout. So based upon this argument, we can assume that there's low youth voter turnout because the youth feel as though that the government doesn't necessarily care about them, that they don't have as big of a voice that they feel they should have.
So now let's look at how voter turnout in general of registered voters compares around the world. And you'll notice that the US is lower even in general turnout. So we can see here that Belgium, a democracy, has 88%, Sweden, 87%, the list goes on and on. We're fourth from, last. So just overall, not even with youth voting, it's important to recognize that amongst all voters, we are just very low in voter turnout as it is, which may also help to explain our low youth voter turnout as well.
So kind of leading into the but. So in 2018 midterm elections and the 2020 election, US youth voting increased by 11%, which meant almost 50% of youth voted. And we wanted to dive a little bit deeper into why this happened and how this can be maintained.
So we first want to ask the question about what was different about 2020. 2020 obviously was a very unprecedented time with the COVID-19 pandemic affecting everyone's lives like nothing we had ever seen before, which in return led to an increase of absentee ballots due to the pandemic. So absentee ballots, people were mailing in their ballots ahead of time because they didn't want to go to the voting places because of potential exposure to COVID, obviously. So this also shows that election day voting drops while mail voting soars, which is just attributed to the last slide as well, showing that people chose to vote early and in person at lesser rates than voting by mail.
So now kind of with all this information, what conclusions can we draw from this? So first, we're able to make the conclusion that absentee ballots are likely more convenient and attractive to youth voters, which is why there might have been a particular uptick in youth voting. In order to maintain the 2020 increase of youth voters, absentee ballots should continue to be advertised, promoted, and readily available to all voters.
In 2020, there was also a large emergence of social issues that youth tend to care about. So obviously there was the nationwide movement for racial justice in relation to Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, and a lot of protests and social activism around those issues. There was a big emphasis on climate change as well as voting rights. So this may help to explain why youth were coming out at larger margins. They were voting because there were pertinent issues that they cared about, that they, I guess, suspected that elected officials would have a say in.
So kind of asking the question of what we can do to fix the issue of low youth voter turnout and encourage the United States youth to vote at comparable rates of peer democracies, because as we've showed in previous slides, the US ranks rather low in comparison to the rest of the world. So just continuing to kind of figure out what we can do to fix the issue of low youth voter turnout.
So now we are going to hear from a 20-year-old health and exercise science major at Syracuse University, answering the following question. What would incentivize you to vote? Today we have with us Sophie Locks, a 20-year-old health and exercise science major here at Syracuse University. And we're going to ask her the following question. Sophie, what would motivate you and incentivize you to vote in the next upcoming election?
Well, there's a lot of different issues that have come to light within the past couple of months, specifically the new abortion rules. And as a college student and as a woman, I feel like it is a violation of our rights. And so it would be really important for me to make sure that my vote would count.
Great, Sophie. Thanks so much. Any other issues that would incentivize you to vote?
Well, as a college student, college tuition has gotten really high, and so there's a lot of debt. And so, especially here at Syracuse University, with tuition being upwards of $70,000 a year, making sure that I'm not, completely burdened with all the debt would be really helpful for me and my future, especially because with the amount of money you pay for college and for your degree, it takes a lot of time to pay back.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Daisy.
So now let's talk about how perhaps paying attention to one issue can show that the government cares and in return increase youth voter turnout. So as we discussed before, according to Albert and Kohler, people do not vote when they feel as though their government does not care about them. So one specific issue that youth care about, and as we heard in the previous interview, and that candidates should try to make one of their priorities in talking about in their candidacy, is the idea of student debt and student loans. So as you can see, student debt is a huge issue in our country that does not exist primarily in as large margins and comparable democracies as you can see in this graph. So as you can see in France, the average public university tuition is $217, and really there's no debt there. And really our debt is just much higher than, and our tuition is much higher than almost all other countries and colleges, specifically private institutions. So now let's take a look at Sweden, as Sweden has one of the highest youth voter turnouts as well as general voter turnouts in the world. So interestingly enough, in both Sweden and the US, student debt averages to be somewhat similar, as you can see from this graph, just around the $20,000 to $30,000 mark. US average student debt is $28,400 upon graduation, while Swedish debt is $21,000. So $7,000 in comparison to the other gaps we saw, such as in France, where debt was only at 217, is not that large of a margin.
So now let's talk about the difference and between loan forgiveness and how it is paid back in these different countries that we've been examining. So in the United States, borrowers are required to begin making payments on their student loans 6 months after graduating. And in Sweden, borrowers pay off their loans over a much longer period, and borrowers can be in repayment for up to 25 years, whereas the repayment period in the US is much shorter, and the typical borrower in Sweden pays for 22 years. So we can see that this larger gap that they have to pay over a longer period of time allows them much more leeway. So now looking at this last graph, we can see how voter turnout in the national parliament elections went. And when looking at this, we can see that the age 18 to 24 range votes at about 87%. And this can possibly be attributed to youth voters in Sweden feeling that their government cares about them more and has their best interests at heart. And an example of this would be their student loan forgiveness or their shorter repayment period and things of that nature.
So what does this mean, and how can we translate this back to US politics and youth voter turnout here and getting it to increase? So this shows us that by focusing on one issue, such as student debt, we can show youth voters that we care, which will in turn hopefully increase youth voter participation at somewhat similar margins that we see in comparable democracies such as Sweden. Other issues that the US should attempt to focus on are abortion laws. In light of the recent Roe versus Wade potentially being overturned, this is an issue that data has shown and that we believe youth would really care about and appreciate if candidates were focusing on it and getting that message out to the youth. It would incentivize young voters to come out and vote if they know that their candidates are supporting things that they believe in larger margins. And we can also see from the data that we should continue to utilize absentee ballots as they increase youth voting at large margins.